Here's a turbo that I wanted to share with you that took 3 turbos to make it into one. This I would call an HX40 S200 eBay turbo hybrid. The compressor housing is an S200. The bearing housing is an HX40, but I machined it down to fit inside of the S200 compressor housing. Then I also machined the bearing housing for an O-ring to seal it to the compressor housing because the S200's never had an O-ring there. The turbine housing is the housing that was on the turbo originally. That was some kind of copy. I don't know what kind of turbo this was. It was something that I've seen once before, but it's very unusual because I've only seen one of them ever before. So I guess it's some kind of copy turbo, and it's really hard to get parts for because it's it's got parts from like a K24 in it or something. It's just something really unique. This turbine housing, I kind of like it because it's a T3 twin scroll. It's pretty decent in size, and the advantage to the turbine housing is that it fits the HX40 64x76 turbine without any machining. So it was perfect just to be able to throw it on this turbo and to be able to fix this turbo for this guy. The only thing I had to do here was machine this bearing housing and then machine the compressor housing to fit onto the cartridge, or the compressor housing to fit the compressor wheel. The bearing housing gets machined down so that it fits inside of this pocket. This is an idea that my brother Ian came up with because we were trying to figure out how to fix this turbo, because the original compressor housing that was on this turbo, or with this turbine housing, the compressor housing really couldn't be used for anything. I tried to see if a TO4E plate would fit, wouldn't fit. Tried to put an HX bearing housing and that wouldn't fit. So this was the perfect way to fix this turbo, because I had this compressor housing sitting around for several years, probably 5 years now, off a turbo that needed a rebuild, and I just ended up using it to fix this guy's turbo. This guy, he bought a Nissan Skyline. I think it's an R33. It's either that or an R34, but I really don't think that he would have an R34. So he bought that, and it had this weird turbo on there, and he wanted to try and fix it, and we're kind of limited on what the options are. The reason being is because it has to be T3 and it has to fit in the space to have clearance for the valve cover. The issue he had with this turbo on there was that it had broke the compressor wheel and there weren't replacement parts available for it. Another problem that he was having was that the compressor housing on the other turbo was sitting so close to the valve cover that it was a concern that it may not fit if we use an HX40 compressor housing, which is why we went with this cover, because the diameter is smaller. So it's a perfect match to be able to fix this guy's turbo for his Skyline. Here's the compressor housing that this turbo had. One thing that is interesting is if you look at the back, if you know turbos well enough, and I guess if you follow the channel, the first thing I would think is this might fit a GT40R, but it doesn't. It's a little bit too small. But now the other thing to keep in mind is if you took a GT40R plate and machined it down, you could use this compressor housing on a GT40R, and the compressor wheel actually may be about that size. I think it was about 61 millimeter. So this could probably be machined out to fit a GT4088 or a GTX 4088R compressor wheel. The outlet on it, I think, is like maybe 2 or maybe 2.5. It's actually a little bit bigger than the other cover that we used. One thing I want to mention is if anybody thinks that they want to use this, they're welcome to it, because I'm probably just going to throw it away because I don't know how else to use it. The problem is that if I had a GT40R to put this on, I'd have to really have one that needs a compressor housing. So what's the odds of that? Because I don't have the GT40R bearing housings, I have the cages, and the turbine housing is also a custom size for the GT40R. So there's several things that would prevent me from being able to use this compressor housing, so I feel like I should just toss it. But it would be cool to have for a custom project, but I just don't have a GT40R that needs a compressor housing. I started this project, I had to machine, or I just prefer to grab them on the inside, so I machined the inside down, then cut that straight, and then flared it for the inlet here to the compressor wheel. It does have anti-surge, which is pretty cool to be able to have that. The HX40 with the 60 by 86 millimeter 7-blade compressor wheel is rated around 700 horsepower. That's usually the peak at around 40 psi. Now the HX40s usually had different turbine housings on them. I think the smallest was a 17 cm. This one on here is probably relatively close to like a 16 cm because it looks pretty close in size to the H1C turbine housings. So this one should make between 650 to 700 horsepower if he decides to max it out. If he just kind of has it casually, or does the build kind of casual, then it's still rated between 500 to 600 if he doesn't run it at high boost. That's everything for this video. I hope you were able to see something that is unique and you haven't seen before, because this isn't typically something that I do on a daily basis, but it just kind of shows you when you have to really make something work, what's possible to be able to fix somebody else's problem. Otherwise, this guy would have to buy another turbo and potentially another manifold to make it fit because it was so close to the valve cover.